Imagine living in a world where the shape of your thoughts could condemn you without a word, where an unspoken doubt, a whispered question, or the absence of expected praise might brand you a criminal in the eyes of men who claim to speak for God, but served the shifting tides of power and fear. This was not merely the reality of medieval Europe's persecution of heresy. It was a calculated strategy, a machinery of silence. Designed to fabricate guilt out of uncertainty, suspicion out of silence and sin, out of any deviation from the prescribed rituals of thought and belief. The law of heresy, as enforced from courtroom to cathedral, was not a fixed doctrine, but a living, adaptive weapon honed for political and institutional self-defense. It thrived not by identifying explicit opposition, but by casting its net so wide, and its rules so vague that anyone, at any time, could be redefined as an enemy of faith, truth, and order. Inquisitors and magistrates did not need blasphemous words or manifest rebel acts. They watched for omissions, hesitations, or the failure to join the chorus of conformity at the right moment. Silence itself was sculpted into evidence. To withhold assent was heresy. To question in private was heresy. To neglect a ritual, skip a festival, or avoid communion was grounds for investigation. The tools for fabricating heresy were as much psychological as legal. Under the doctrine that truth must be spoken, enforced confession became mandatory, and authorities developed elaborate rituals, public inquests, secret interrogations, collective denunciations, where suspects were pressured not just to reveal forbidden beliefs, but to speak against others, generating new suspects and volunteers for the machinery of accusation. The Code of Heresy prosecution weaponized ambiguity. Church councils and royal courts produced sprawling legal texts, dozens of articles listing prohibited doctrines, often phrased in convoluted, self-contradictory language that ensured the lists could be expanded or manipulated at will. Doctrinal deviations were defined not just by explicit opposition, but by contumacy, persistent failure to speak or act in ways prescribed by authority. Archival records reveal that entire communities could be indicted on hearsay and rumor, their heretical silence alleged by enemies, commercial rivals, or disfavored neighbors, for motives sometimes as petty as jealousies over land, property, or social standing. Fabricating heresy relied upon the intrusion of law into spaces once deemed private: dinner conversations, family prayer, the contents of household books. Religious visitations required villagers to recite formulas, perform gestures, and publicly affirm the language of creed. Any falter would be noted and filed, sometimes decades later, as stepping stones for prosecution when political winds shifted. Silence soon became a contest. To say too much risked invention, but to say too little risked condemnation for willful equivocation, itself now a coded crime. The machinery of fabrication was more than fear, it was strategy. Kings, bishops, and city leaders wielded heresy as a lever to suppress dissent, seize estates, and eliminate rivals. Social outcasts, women outside prescribed roles, intellectuals deviating from accepted doctrine, and families who clung to forbidden rituals became convenient scapegoats, their silence interpreted as guilt and their reputations shattered by mere absence of public loyalty. The archives overflow with forced confessions procured through torture, an innovation justified as necessary to extract truth from those whose silence was seen as a greater crime than any spoken word. The more persistently a suspect maintained innocence or offered measured, reasoned speech, the more their restraint became evidence of heretical cunning. The unrepentant, read one infamous inquisitorial manual, are known by the absence of confession and sorrow. Fabricating heresy was a cycle fed by institutional paranoia, political ambition, and the need to demonstrate order in a world racked by uncertainty, plague, war, famine, and doctrinal schism. Heresy was not only disobedience to faith, but defiance of authority and social stratification. To accuse a neighbor of silence or hidden thought was to participate in the affirmation of one's own orthodoxy. Communities learned to police themselves, reporting every whisper, every absence, every deviation, ensuring that the machinery of law, once set in motion, never lacked for new fuel. Even the process of reconciliation was coded. Those found guilty of heretical silence faced punishments designed to erase their personhood: public penance, exile, confiscation of property, branding or mutilation, and sometimes execution. Families lived with the permanent scars of suspicion, denied rights or driven to poverty by legal mechanisms that never required actual proof. Only the presence of silence, the residue of fear, and the intervention of those eager to display loyalty by destroying others. As the centuries turned, and the law of heresy absorbed new technologies of surveillance and record-keeping, the fabricated nature of guilt persisted, serving ever-changing rulers and doctrines, while remaining rooted in the power to make silence speak louder than any truth. Heresy became a metaphor for opposition to power itself, a code rewritten with every crisis, a label affixed to whoever had the misfortune to be out of favor, out of sight, out of voice, or simply out of step. The systematic manufacture of heretical guilt required extensive bureaucratic infrastructure, designed to transform natural human diversity of thought and expression into criminal categories that could be prosecuted through apparently legitimate legal procedures that served institutional interests rather than genuine spiritual or social welfare. Inquisitorial courts developed elaborate taxonomies of suspicious silence, cataloging different types of reticence and assigning varying degrees of guilt to hesitation patterns that revealed nothing about actual belief, but everything about the psychological state of individuals subjected to interrogation, designed to produce incriminating responses, regardless of factual innocence or guilt. The cultivation of informants within communities created networks of surveillance that operated through kinship ties, economic relationships, and social obligations that transformed ordinary human interactions into opportunities for intelligence gathering and denunciation that served institutional needs for maintaining steady flows of suspects and ensuring that heresy prosecution remained a profitable and politically useful enterprise. Professional witnesses emerged who specialized in providing testimony against accused heretics, developing standardized narratives and rehearsed accusations that could be adapted to different cases while maintaining the appearance of spontaneous revelation of hidden religious crimes that justified continued persecution and property confiscation. The legal framework for heresy prosecution included provisions for retroactive application of new doctrinal standards to past behavior, allowing authorities to criminalize actions and statements that had been legally acceptable at the time they occurred, creating systems of temporal injustice that made perfect compliance impossible, while ensuring steady supplies of prosecutable offenses. Documentary fabrication became a specialized skill, as inquisitors learned to create convincing evidence of heretical activity through selective quotation, contextual distortion, and strategic omission of exculpatory information that might interfere with predetermined verdicts designed to serve political rather than judicial purposes. The psychological techniques employed in heresy fabrication included systematic isolation of suspects, from family and community support systems, prolonged imprisonment under conditions designed to break mental resistance, and calculated alternation between harsh treatment and false compassion that created emotional dependency on interrogators who offered the only available relief from systematic psychological torture. Sleep deprivation, nutritional manipulation, sensory bombardment, and other forms of psychological coercion were employed to create mental states in which suspects would agree to any accusation and implicate any individual suggested by interrogators seeking to expand their networks of persecution beyond the original targets. The economic incentives underlying heresy fabrication created powerful motivations for aggressive prosecution, as inquisitors received portions of confiscated property from convicted heretics, while legal professionals, court officials, and support staff derived steady income from trials that generated fees regardless of their outcomes or social utility. Regional competition between different inquisitorial jurisdictions led to innovations in heresy detection and prosecution techniques, as authorities sought to demonstrate their effectiveness and secure continued institutional support through impressive statistics of conviction and property confiscation that served bureaucratic rather than religious purposes. The development of standardized interrogation procedures created assembly line efficiency in heresy prosecution, with printed manuals, form documents, and procedural checklists that allowed relatively inexperienced officials to conduct systematic persecution without requiring extensive theological education or sophisticated understanding of the doctrinal issues supposedly at stake in individual cases. Mass trials involving entire communities suspected of collective heresy were conducted through abbreviated procedures that presumed guilt based on geographic residence or family relationships rather than individual evidence, creating systems of collective punishment that destroyed social cohesion while demonstrating institutional power to reshape entire populations through the systematic application of legal terror. The intersection of heresy law with other legal systems created opportunities for using religious persecution to achieve secular objectives, including debt collection, property disputes, inheritance conflicts, and commercial competition that could be resolved through accusations of religious deviance that provided legal cover for obviously economic motivations. Marriage dissolution, child custody disputes, and family property arrangements were often resolved through heresy accusations that eliminated inconvenient relatives while providing moral justification for outcomes that served financial interests rather than genuine religious concerns or social justice. The role of gender in heresy fabrication reveals systematic patterns of persecution that targeted women for expressing independence, demonstrating learning, claiming spiritual authority, or simply failing to conform to prescribed roles in ways that threatened patriarchal authority, while providing convenient scapegoats for social problems that male authorities could not understand or control. Female accusations of heresy often involved sexual components that reflected male anxieties about feminine sexuality, while providing titillating entertainment for male audiences who participated in trials that combined religious righteousness with pornographic speculation about the private lives of accused women. The international dimensions of heresy fabrication included diplomatic implications as accusations against foreign merchants, travelers, or residents were used to achieve political objectives in relationships between different kingdoms and territories that competed for economic advantage and territorial control through apparently religious conflicts. Pilgrimage routes became highways for the transmission of heresy accusations, as authorities in different regions cooperated in tracking suspected individuals whose movements across political boundaries provided opportunities for international collaboration in persecution that served multiple political agendas simultaneously. The technological innovations in heresy detection included architectural modifications to churches and public buildings designed to facilitate surveillance of religious observance with hidden viewing areas, acoustic design features, and strategic placement of officials who could monitor compliance with ritual requirements and identify individuals whose behavior suggested religious deviation or insufficient enthusiasm. Written examinations testing religious knowledge became tools for identifying heretics through questions designed to create logical traps that made any answer potentially incriminating, while providing objective-appearing evidence of religious deviance that could justify persecution of individuals who had committed no observable crimes. The seasonal rhythms of heresy prosecution correlated with agricultural cycles, religious calendars, and political events that created predictable patterns of persecution intensity based on institutional needs for revenue, public attention, and demonstration of authority rather than actual fluctuations in heretical activity or threats to religious orthodoxy. Harvest seasons often saw increased heresy prosecutions as communities had disposable income that could be confiscated, while the completion of agricultural work freed personnel for participation in trials and executions that served entertainment as well as judicial functions. Religious festivals provided opportunities for identifying heretics through compulsory public participation in ritual activities that revealed nonconformity, while creating communal bonding experiences that strengthened group identity through the exclusion and persecution of designated outsiders who embodied threats to social order. Military campaigns created opportunities for heresy accusations against those who failed to provide adequate support for supposedly holy wars, while also providing pretexts for eliminating potential domestic opposition through religious rather than political charges that carried greater moral authority and public support. The decline of systematic heresy fabrication occurred gradually through combination of political changes, intellectual developments, and practical recognition that religious persecution created more problems than it solved for authorities seeking to maintain stable governance and economic prosperity in increasingly complex social environments. Enlightenment criticism of religious persecution provided intellectual frameworks for questioning the effectiveness and morality of heresy prosecution while offering alternative approaches to managing social diversity and political dissent that did not require systematic violation of basic human dignity and rational legal procedure. The emergence of religious pluralism and legal toleration reduced the political utility of heresy accusations while creating new systems for managing religious diversity that served state interests more effectively than persecution while avoiding the administrative costs and social disruption associated with systematic religious violence. The modern legacy of heresy fabrication techniques can be observed in contemporary forms of political persecution, ideological enforcement, and social control that employ similar psychological and legal mechanisms to create criminal categories from natural human diversity, while claiming moral authority for systematic oppression that serves institutional rather than social interests. Understanding the historical development of heresy fabrication provides crucial insight into the mechanisms of institutional persecution and the importance of maintaining legal protections against the criminalization of thought, belief, and expression that threaten individual freedom and social stability, when legal systems serve institutional power rather than human welfare and social justice. Contemporary political movements, religious institutions, and social organizations continue to employ techniques derived from historical heresy fabrication, including the criminalization of silence, the weaponization of ambiguity, and the systematic manufacture of guilt from natural human behavior that threatens established authority and institutional control. The psychological warfare involved in heresy fabrication created populations living in constant fear of accusation, dependent on institutional approval for any sense of security, and unable to trust their own moral and intellectual judgment in the face of constantly shifting definitions of acceptable thought and behavior that served authority rather than truth or social welfare. Reflect on how the law of silence lives on, in modern institutions, in social media, in the demand for constant affirmation and the punishment of doubt, difference, or thoughtful restraint. The machinery that once turned silence into heresy continues to whisper its warnings in the expectation of public compliance, and the chilling threat that failing to join the chorus may condemn you when power seeks a scapegoat or the crowd needs a sacrifice. If this journey into the shadowed corridors of fabricated heresy has illuminated the machinery behind historical and modern repression, share your thoughts, subscribe for more revelations of institutional power, and question: would your silence save you or doom you when the law itself is designed to make every absence, hesitation, or uncertainty a crime?